So today's videocast is talking about early childhood, and as we talk about some of these concepts, we're going to also see a few clips. There's a lot of debate about what constitutes early childhood. Generally speaking, we can start to think about early childhood as being the period of time after toddlerhood, and because children sometimes develop at different speeds, that is sometimes difficult to really fully identify. So I suppose you could put the early childhood range anywhere between like 2 or 3 to maybe 5 or 6. It's sort of that preschool age, that post-toddler, preschool, not quite yet in kindergarten, but sometimes we put kindergarten in there. So it's that age range, the toddler years to about maybe the end of kindergarten. And there's a lot of stuff going on, of course, in early childhood. So one of the things that's happening from a biophysical perspective is you're seeing continued explosive physical growth, hopefully, both in terms of size and height and weight, head circumference, also in terms of the ability to develop more complicated use of language, going from really only gross motor skills to having pretty decent fine motor skills, and there's still more development to come in that way. But you're seeing what seems like a baby turning into a kid, basically, and all of the physical development that goes in that. You're seeing the kind of cognitive brain development that allows kids to have better memories and better recall, and to be able to store those memories and get them back. And sometimes kids will surprise you when they come up with something and say, "Oh, remember last year when we went to this playground and we played these games?" And you're looking at them like you remember that from last year, but they're capable of doing that now, and that's a big shift for kids coming out of toddlerhood. They also have better ability to concentrate, better ability to focus, all of those kinds of things. And the major biophysical risk to kids at this time is often accidents. Some of them, of course, minor, ordinary childhood accidents, but with more mobility and more freedom and a greater push for independence comes greater risk for injury of some kind. So you have perhaps car accidents or more serious childhood accidents, but broken bones, say, or concussions, or things like that, falls. So this is all kind of in the category of increased development. And then, of course, if you have a child with those kinds of injuries, that has then that biophysical experience has then a lot of impact on what happens emotionally and socially as well. We'll talk about that. So what is kind of the big summary of what's going on in early childhood? Kids are seeing, as you see in this slide here, a greater awareness of their own behavior and what triggers their behavior and why they're doing what they're doing, particularly in sort of the later stages of early childhood. We mentioned that they're becoming linguistically much more sophisticated. What you see, hopefully, is a decrease in aggressive acting out because of this third point. They can use words more than actions. You can start to see kids anticipate the wishes and actions of others. They're much more self-sufficient. They have a better capacity for self-regulation, hopefully. And hopefully, if what's happening is healthy, they're getting a sense of being internally well-organized. They have a better sense of emotional regulation, a better sense of that developing sense of who they are, where they belong, who their family is, who they can count on, those kinds of hopefully healthy milestones. One of the things that we'll talk more about in class is Freud's notion of what is going on psychologically in early childhood, with the big milestone, according to Freud, the development of neurotic character formation. That essentially means that somebody is leaving the pre-Oedipal stage into sort of the post-Oedipal stage, the Oedipal post-Oedipal stage, and by the end of early childhood. And that means, according to Freud, the big milestone at the end of early childhood being the accomplishment of developing a superego and having a better ability to have a stronger ego and more impulse control over things like the id. But of course, if a 3-year-old is in the early childhood range, which they are, you can see the great range between 3 and 6, for example. The stuff that Freud is talking about in terms of accomplishments, you wouldn't even hope to see until maybe 5 or 6, and then frankly, you might have to wait even longer after that. But we'll talk more about that in class, but that's one of Freud's big pieces of character development. In our previous podcast, we talked a lot about attachment and the development of attachment, particularly if there are attachment problems. And so this is just a real quick kind of summary of that. But I think a major piece being that with the physical and psychological development of memory adds a piece to attachment that is special to early childhood, in that they can remember and act out through play and act out through their memories the kinds of hopefully comforting interactions that builds for strong attachments. They can go inside themselves and pull on those internalizations of security and relationships and play out scenes, talk about stuff, and use those internalizations, those internal objects, so to speak, in object relations theory, as a way of coping with stress, anxiety, other kinds of things. And that if one of the things that we hope for in healthy attachment is the idea of a blueprint, that you're taking those healthy attachments and those healthy attachments are becoming the blueprint for later relationships, you're starting to see that happen in early childhood with the way that attachment relationships are being generalized. One of the things that happens socially in early childhood is that oftentimes a child's world is starting to get a little bigger. It's no longer the intense, small world of the immediate family. You might have much more contact with friends. Maybe a child is going to daycare or preschool. Because of a child's increased physical abilities, maybe they're going to the playground, or maybe they're going to other places where they're coming into contact with other people, and you're starting to see their world get a little bigger. And as their world gets bigger, you can see evidence of their attachment styles developing and how they are relating to that world. It's in early childhood that we can start to see some pretty clear differences in attachment styles in childhood. And you can kind of see this slide here that in some ways summarizes what we've been speaking about in earlier classes about the differences among these children. But probably something to keep in mind here as you think about these differences is that it's more than just their behavior with, say, one person. What you're looking at is that this child has a pattern of these behaviors across relationships and across social settings. So in terms of the cognitive development of early childhood, one of the things that we're kind of going to highlight is Piaget, and Piaget is talking about the pre-operational period, ages 2 to 7, that early childhood area. And of this stage, there are essentially sort of two substages. One is the ability to have symbolic functioning, which, say, for example, you can see in young children between the ages of 2 and 4. One of the things that they are doing at that age that can start to show you that they have this ability is, like, for example, playing house, where they are representing mentally objects and relationships within their play that aren't immediately right in front of them. Maybe they can start to draw a very rudimentary picture of relationships in their life, loved ones in their life, and talk about those people. That person isn't immediately in front of them, but yet they're able to call up their image of that person, both physically and emotionally, and talk about that. You can start to see kids having more symbolic play, even if it's very basic. And all of those things are examples of children starting to develop this skill, which is actually a really big skill. You want kids to be able to call on their internalized references of important people and places and things. And, as we mentioned earlier, that's also an indication of attachment. One of the things that is really normal in symbolic functioning is the idea of egocentrism. This goes back to some earlier points I think we were talking about in terms of healthy narcissism. You want kids, frankly, to believe that they are the center of the universe, and that's really egocentrism. And that, at this stage in development, is healthy and okay. It's not necessarily a cause for concern until later in development, where having that kind of self-focus is probably going to have particularly social consequences. The second part of this stage, in terms of Piaget, is the beginning of, frankly, logical thought, intuitive thought. This is where kids of this age usually ask adults around them a million why questions and how questions. It's not that they're being annoying, although frankly sometimes it can be annoying. They are trying to figure out the world, and they're trying to figure out the world in terms of logic and reasoning capabilities. And because they're so young, they can't really do this with a lot of complexity, but the how and the why and the endless questions are oftentimes their way of trying to figure things out, and to take that knowledge in and start to build on that, the ability to think logically or having some kind of reasoning. Information processing is a very important cognitive development. It also, of course, reflects the growing brain development that kids are having, and it really focuses on one's ability to have cohesive attention and memory. And so we'll talk more about this in class. But what you can see oftentimes is kids having more ability to attend to a task, say, or remember events or remember people, and that they can remember it. That's one piece of brain development. They can call it up, which is the second piece of brain development, and they can talk about it in a coherent way, which is yet another piece of brain development. This is very related to the development of speech and language. If you think about even yourselves, some of your earlier memories from childhood, the ones that you are remembering, what you might even identify as your earliest memories, usually have a verbal narrative in your head, and that's why you can remember it. Before the age of 3, people talk about the idea of infantile amnesia. That really reflects that before the age of 3, children don't have a particularly solid grasp of language, so their memories, it's not that they're gone, but they're just different, and they're coded differently in the brain. This last point is something we will talk about a lot, which is the idea of developmental waves. So when we talk about child development, it's tempting to think that things happen in this very logical series of steps, like going up a set of stairs. It's not quite like that in child development. It's much more about waves, meaning that one child on one end of the continuum and another child at the other end of the continuum are actually still in quote-unquote the normal range. And the waves of development, particularly in early childhood, are very broad. You can see kids of the same age range who have drastically different abilities, and the one who has lesser abilities isn't necessarily diagnosable or in trouble. They are just at the other end of the developmental wave. And certainly if you have a lot of experience with children in your personal life or in your professional life, then you certainly have seen this probably in terms of, say, language or in terms of emotional regulation. Some kids are better than others, but the kids who are struggling aren't necessarily in trouble yet. They're just at the other end of a wave. So we're going to talk a lot about emotional regulations, and one of the things that has to happen, of course, for kids is they have to start to understand what emotions are, and they have to be able to label them and understand them and express them in a way that hopefully is healthy. And they need a lot of help with this. And the way that adults around them can help them is by using their relationship with children to help them identify emotions, name them, acknowledge that they have feelings, and help kids contain themselves, frankly, and be that external emotional regulator until kids have the internal capacity to have emotional regulation. So actually I'm going to go back to this earlier slide, because one of the things I'm going to show you now is a family where emotional regulation and adults stepping in to help in emotional regulation are not going so well. So this clip I'm going to show you now is a clip from a documentary done by PBS in the late 80s, early 90s. And so you can certainly see in this documentary the fact that it's an older film. And one of the reasons, though, to keep showing it and to keep pulling from it is that while there's a lot of evidence that it's an older show, there's also some really fantastic video captured of families in action, so to speak. And so this film follows families at different points in development in their early childhood years, and it does that from all across the world in different cultures. And so the family that I'm highlighting for a child who's really, really struggling with emotional regulation is a Russian family. And just in terms of social context, at the time that this film was shot, Russia was not really just Russia, it was the Soviet Union, and it was a communist country, and a lot of Eastern Europe, which is now its own independent country, was all part of the Soviet Union. And so this is a family growing up in the Soviet Union under communism during a period of time in Russian culture that is synonymous with a lot of difficulty and a lot of hardships. So what you're seeing is a young boy named Stas, who I think is about 4 or 5, and he is growing up with his family in Russia, and we're picking up this point in Stas's development where his family is coming back with a new sibling. His mother has just given birth. So this is about a 4 or 5 minute clip, and we'll watch that and come back and discuss more about it.
And Misha Popov bring their new son Vitaly home from the hospital. Different families follow different scripts with vastly different consequences for both parents and children. For 3-year-old Stas, baby Vitaly has brought change and stress.
Покажи книжку. Я ему уже показал. Показал уже? А он не видел, Стас, еще покажи. У него же глаза были закрыты. Ну, покажи.
The Popovs are waiting to get their own apartment, so for now, they live with Misha's parents. The arrival of a new baby is the very essence of family life. At the same time, it is thoroughly disruptive of the family. For every new baby changes a family irrevocably. Stas now has to share the stage of family life with a new sibling, a new character. It's up to the giants, his parents, to set a tone for the scene.
Здравствуйте. Ты чего, малыш? Так, давайте ваше сокровище. Тут мы стоит. Ключ подстелите, пожалуйста. Это за что же ты нас убьешь? Что это ты такое придумал?
Вас не пустил за повод. Я вас задержал за повод. Нет, не упустил.
Это ревность.
Дураки плохие. Дураки плохие.
А что это ты так говоришь, а? Ну почему ты так плохо говоришь?
Тебя убьют.
А кто же братика будет лечиться?
Вот.
Останешься один? Кто же будет? Кто же будет?
Я в сварку.
Миш, вот сюда ее пока ставь, потом мы перенесем.
A few weeks later, the Popovs move to their own apartment. More stress for Stas.
Стас. Упрямец.
Somehow, everyone in the Popov family has learned to be critical of Stas. Stas the bad, the angry one. It has become a part of the family script, an item in the self-definition of the Popov family. Misha is aware of Stas's anger and jealousy, but he offers no comfort. Instead of support at a time of stress, just provocative jokes. Psychologists point out that the move to a new home, like the arrival of a new sibling, is inevitably stressful for children. But disruptions are part of every life, just like being small when you are very young. The question for parents is, what to do for children? Do you play an active role in your family drama, or stand in the wings and blame fate or circumstance?
Ну, со Стасиком я попала в больницу после родов, и он попал в больницу с флегмоной, потому что ему занесли инфекцию в пупочек.
Вот. А с Виталиком было намного проще. То есть он даже был, я думаю, что не подвержен вообще никакой инфекции, потому что иммунитет у него был очень стойкий к этому. Вот. Так что с Виталиком вообще проблем было меньше, чем со Стасиком.
Sturdy, happy Vitaly. Angry, wounded Stas. Two children, brothers. Same parents, same household, but a deepening gulf is opening between them.
So if you think back about that clip that you just saw, clearly this example of Stas is an example where his parents are really struggling to help this young boy with what he's experiencing and what he's feeling. And so because nobody is helping him, he is dysregulated in his behavior, but also in his feelings and in his thinking pattern. And so is Stas diagnosable at this point? No, probably not. But what we're going to see is at later points in the class, we're going to come back to Stas and his family over and over again, and we'll talk about what trajectory Stas is on and what's going to happen with him. But one of the things I'm certainly going to do in the class that follows this podcast is ask you what you think about Stas and where you think he's headed and why that's happening to him. And so we'll come back to Stas, but I think that short clip there might be a better example of kind of what not to do, frankly, than what hopefully to do. But we also have lots of clips that we're going to embed that talk about what you can do and what is a good source of coaching and support. So how can adults around children help children with this earlier task from earlier slides? Essentially by following these 5 strategies. And one of the first things, frankly, that can be one of the hardest steps in this 5-step process is number 1, for adults around that child to become aware of that child's emotion. And that seems like it should be so simple, but in fact, if kids are acting out and kind of spilling all over the place, it can be really difficult to figure out from the adult's point of view what that kid is actually feeling. Is Stas, for example, shows signs of being an angry kid, and is it that he's angry? I mean, he might be partly angry, but he might be having a whole collection of other feelings as well that he can't identify and that he doesn't understand. And so it becomes part of the job of an adult is to do number 1 accurately, frankly, and to not necessarily fall for what the behavior says only, because one's emotional response might be much more complicated than that. And then the next part is a sort of a state of being, I suppose, from the adult point of view, rather than seeing problematic behavior as something to control and contain. According to this sort of theory of emotional coaching, when adults see a child struggling, one of the things that they should try to keep in mind is that they have an opportunity here to actually connect very closely with children and to help them and to be a teacher and a coach to them. And the way that happens is through empathic listening and validating the child's feelings. One of the ways that happens is to try to help children find the words to label the emotion that they're feeling, and at the same time be setting limits about what one can and cannot do and how one can act and not act. And trying to set limits and explore these strategies is the hopeful outcome of this process. So does this work 100% of the time? No, it doesn't. So you'll work with parents, or if you think about perhaps the children in your own life, you might try to do this. Is this going to work every single time? No, it probably won't work every single time. But the times that it does work are very, very powerful and helpful to children. And so is this a fail-safe method every time when your kid is having a hard time? No. But if one can kind of adopt the stance that this slide is proposing, that in and of itself goes a long way at helping that child with that ultimate goal, which is described at the bottom, to assist a child in recognizing the emotions that they have and use that experience to help the child learn about him and herself. This will assist the child in problem solving. And so the more the parents and caregivers and loved ones around children can do this, the more powerful learning and development is happening for a child around the incredibly important task of emotional coaching and emotional regulation. One of the things that is very common from an emotional development point of view is the development of fears. Being afraid of the dark, being afraid of dogs, being afraid of monsters in the closet, all of those kinds of fears that children have growing up. Some of them are based in reality, frankly, and some of them are the result of their growing imagination. And one of the things that happens for children as they mature, as they become more complicated in terms of emotional and social development, as their world opens up and becomes bigger, they start to become aware of some of the dangers and uncertainties of the world. And they may also have, at this point, experienced traumatic things that they remember, everything from sort of the mild traumas of everyday life to perhaps really major ones. And so, one of the things that can feed children's fears is a difficulty in understanding still at this point what is real and what is imaginary. And so, an example that I often think of with that second bullet point comes after an experience I had working with a young family after September 11th. So if people remember, of course, that horrible, horrible day and the weeks afterwards, one of the things that was very common was that the news at the time just kept showing again and again and again that footage of the planes hitting the World Trade Center in New York. And so it seemed like every time you turned on the news, you were just seeing that happen again and again and again. And, you know, while it's important, I think, all the time for parents to be aware that the news can be very traumatizing and upsetting for children and try to limit their exposure to news and news coverage. You know, everybody was watching the news at this point, obviously. And so one of the families that I worked with had a young boy who was 3 or 4 at the time who just was decompensating all over the place, at home and at daycare and all around. This child had a long history of very traumatic losses. So to see the news was very upsetting for him and very triggering to him. But one of the things that came out in my work with this young family, with his mom and with him, was that he was watching the news like everybody else was, and he was seeing this repeated footage of planes hitting the World Trade Center. And to him, in his child brain, he thought he was seeing a new event every time. And so while adults have the capacity to understand that they're seeing essentially a rerun, to this little boy, he didn't understand that, and he thought that he was seeing a new terrorist attack every time he saw that. He didn't recognize that he was seeing something over and over again. So to him, the horrible events of September 11th were happening constantly. You know, it wasn't just one terrible day. It seemed as though the United States and major cities were being attacked every single day, multiple times a day. And he was absolutely in a state of total panic about that. And so I think that that's a good example to try to understand. We think we might know what kids are experiencing, and we think we might know why they're doing what they're doing, but if we can really slow down and try very hard to understand them in their own terms, then sometimes we get new information. And so with this little guy, yeah, it was very clear that he did not understand the difference between real and imaginary events, or real and distorted events, maybe is a better term for this little guy. Because kids don't really understand cause and effect that clearly at this point, and they're also in that developmentally normal state of egocentrism, when bad things happen, they blame themselves. Because if they're the center of the universe for everything that's good, they are probably the center of the universe for everything that's bad. And so what's interesting, I think, in early childhood is that kids are understanding much more about the world, but they're not yet fully equipped to interpret with any kind of accuracy the world either. And so that sets up a lot of confusion for kids and for adults, and all of the ways that they're making sense of the world that are unique to them that may not make sense to adults, but that's what kids are operating on when they're developing emotionally and socially. One of the things that is important to think about is how aggression gets framed and how it gets understood. You know, I have another clip that I'd like to show you about aggression, and this clip goes back to Stas, who is now a little bit older. I think in the first clip he was younger than I anticipated, but in this older clip he is a little bit older. So I'd like to show you this brief clip, and then when we come back to class, ask you about it.
Сколько раз мне говорить одно и то же, а?
Вот тебе.
In Japan, Kagan recognized that the transmission of values and standards of behavior was accomplished almost unconsciously through intimacy between children and parents.
Спасибо.
When Misha says thank you, it's as if he's mocking Stas's feelings.
Ходи.
Далеко?
In the Popov family, lack of intimacy seems to have shut the door to all communication.
Я хотел быть командиром. А вас убью, понял? Убью, и вас отрежу голову.
Командир, кстати, это важно. Их охраняют.
Just as in Japan, what parents do is as important as what they say.
Ну, как вышли?
The Popovs want Stas to be more gentle, but how they go about convincing him seems to teach a different lesson.
Дай по попке стукнешь. Конечно, это не выход из положения, я считаю, что принять физическое такое. Вот. Как-то по-другому, но не знаю, мне даже вот терпения не хватает с ним.
Studies show that coercive physical punishments breed more aggression. Violence begets violence. From the very beginning, Stas hated our Russian sound technician.
Стас, ну, тебе никогда не бывает жалко?
Никогда. Тебе никогда, а маму заела.
Маму жалеешь?
А тебе нет.
Понятно. А папу?
А тебе нет.
As we have seen on childhood, character is never the product of genes or environment. It is always the interaction of the two that makes a human being.
Есть сестра.
Studies in the United States found that the families of very aggressive young boys tend to be unresponsive, both to their children's aggressive behavior and to their hurt feelings.
Вот я соседом по башке.
А почему ты другие неприятности задаешь? Не знаешь? А как же ты будешь отвечать за свои поступки?
The goal of enlightened discipline is not to get the child to submit, but to want to make the right choices. No guilt-inducing harangue will do that.
Это будет, когда это
Stas needs special attention.
ты все время один хочешь быть. Одному скучно. Плохо одному, да? И поиграть не с кем, да? Вот, Стасикову ножку.
Stas brings to the zoo the behavior he has learned at home. For now, Stas is going round and round in close emotional quarters with his parents. But Stas will grow older, and his family will not always be the only characters in his script.
Долго еще кататься будешь? Нравится, да?
Stas will encounter others, teachers, friends.
So this now comes back to this original slide. You know, one of the questions I hope that we'll talk about in class is, what kind of aggression do you think you're seeing with Stas? Are you seeing reactive, aggression that is hostile, angry, retaliatory, kind of deliberate? Or are you seeing aggression that is more proactive, instrumental? Proactive aggression is goal-oriented aggression, and it is oftentimes very deliberate and planful. So one of the more controversial ideas about aggression is that it peaks at age 4 and then starts to decrease. And this may not always really be true. Theoretically speaking, this is tied to the development of language, and that children who develop language abilities more quickly might then act out less aggressively because they can use words. But that I think that there is certainly a debate about that age cutoff for most children, because many children are still learning the kinds of language they would need to have to express emotions and to work through things without aggression beyond age 4. One of the things we can certainly talk about is these last 2 slides in class, what might be some of the biologically predispositions of aggressive children and other prenatal or genetic factors. That's going to tie into a lecture that we're going to do in the next week or so. So we'll come back to that point. And that the idea of sometimes when we see children behaving well, the idea of altruism, the idea of doing things solely for the purpose of others and concern for others, really oftentimes is not present for children under the age of 5. And if we wanted to have a Freudian explanation for that, is that you can't really behave altruistically where your sole motivation is the concern for other people until you have a well-established superego. Anything that looks like altruism before the age of 5, according to more classical psych theory, is more imitation-oriented than coming intrinsically out of the child themselves. But of course, if we think back to that discussion that we had about the talking twin babies, then one of the things that can be seen is that what starts as mimicking becomes intrinsic. So, you can certainly have a debate about whether or not children can behave truly altruistically before the age of 5. And so, if you think about also some of our discussions about different cultural factors, like, for example, competition and individualism versus collective cultures, one of the things that seems to be inherent in more Western cultures that is heavy in competition and individualism is a slower development of empathy. You have to be kind of ruthless, frankly, to come out ahead in a very competitive or individualistic culture. And by nature of that kind of socialization, oftentimes children coming out of those cultures seem a lot less empathic than children who are taught and molded in more collective cultures where there's much more of an identification with the community or the group. I'm going to stop here and add a second podcast for a later time. So we're going to stop at altruism, and we'll have a second podcast about early childhood that corresponds with the week. But at this point, we will stop with physical and emotional development and those